I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
Good.
Well, this topic gives me more agita than most, designer babies. In the first place, I hate the term because it implies a moral judgment from the get-go, like test tube babies used to. I prefer children of choice.
Children of choice.
Yeah.
Guess what? I prefer designer babies.
Yeah, there we go.
to be subtly judgmental of you.
Yeah. I thought you might. Yeah, no, it's been, since I got into bioethics back in graduate school, the reproductive ethics stuff has always been the most contentious.
Right, yeah, and I know that you're the big expert on this, so maybe it's a good idea to start with just some table setting and look at what some of the basic terms are. So one distinction that I think everybody listening needs to be clear about is the one between germline genetic engineering and somatic engineering, right?
Well, let's start one step back. There's the distinction between selection and engineering, right? That we have the ability to test for genetic characteristics and select particular embryos or pregnancies to continue. So that's one thing. Is that really different than engineering? Then in terms of engineering, there's what you do to your body and what you do to your kids, and potentially, usually, what you do to your kids is going to be inheritable. But there's also, you could do things to your body that would be inheritable, like if you change your own germplasm, your own sperm and eggs, then that could be heritable as well. But yes, the heritable, non-inheritable distinction is important for most people.
Right. So I guess the first point you're making goes back to IVF. And that, if I'm understanding you correctly, at some level we've been doing babies of choice or designer babies for many, many years. Namely, if we create several embryos for IVF and select after some kind of scanning process the one that we decide is ideal to implant, that's already a kind of primitive version of babies by choice.
I don't want to sound like an evolutionary psychologist, but this has actually been going on for 2 billion years because gender dimorphism led to sexual selection strategies. And if you look at someone and you say, you seem like a nice person, but I can't imagine raising kids with you, aren't you making partially a choice about what kind of traits you pass on?
Right. Although, you would then be making a choice about the person that you do decide to raise kids with, but that's where the technology at the early stage would end, and then the rest would kind of be, far more low-tech, right?
Right. I mean, selection only gives you a certain limited set of options. And although then we have sperm donation, egg donation, we have the possibility to get other people's gametes in there, and that's been going on for a long time as well.
Right. So, but what we're talking about today is in some way the sort of next logical jump from embryo selection in IVF, and the idea is if you would select on the basis of some criteria and some genetic capability of scanning what the best embryo from several are to implant. If you could, why wouldn't you simply design the best embryo in the first place by a process of germline genetic engineering, namely a process of design at the very, very early stages of conception?
Right in the 70s, when Joe Fletcher wrote, I think it's called The Ethics of Genetic Roulette, he basically posed the question, it's like, why do people think that not caring about making choices about the life that your children will lead is somehow the ethical thing for parents to do? That the more selection, the more choices the parents have, the more opportunities they have to say, I think my kid would be better off this way than that way, or my life would be better off this way than that way. way, and that either of those things are defensible rejections of the contingencies.
Right. But before so that's where it already kind of, and I get why this gives you agita, because my sense is that this kind of goes from 0 to 60 quickly, more quickly than some of the other topics that we've been talking about more.
The history of eugenics, the connection to disability rights, it makes it a very, very complicated set of questions. Yeah.
Now, again, still on the sort of setup neighborhood, though. So CRISPR, the CRISPR technology, gene editing technology, the so-called gene word processor, sometimes is a metaphor that's used for this, really gives all of this a boost. So really makes, before CRISPR, I take it that gene editing was very, very much hit or miss. CRISPR sort of makes it a lot more precise. And so CRISPR is the technology that actually allows us to, in the cases where we have identified a genetic pathway to either a disease or a capability, to edit the germline such that the baby would have or not have the trait, right?
Right. So we're able to, before implantation, and this is where the principle for creative beneficence often comes up. Julian Savulescu articulated this 25 years ago, the idea that when in the situation of IVF, where you have like a dozen fertilized embryos, and you're trying to decide which ones to implant, you have the decision to do a certain series of tests, and then what characteristics are you going to choose on the basis of. So he was trying to think through that obligation that we have to make that choice, that which some would reject. That it's like the trolley problem. It's like, well, I won't pull the lever at all. I'll just stand aside. But once you have those capabilities and you identify genetic markers, and you can do this before you even start creating embryos, you can say, well, I have, our children have a 50% chance of getting ALS, which is terrible degenerative disease, currently no cure. And I'd rather have pregnancies without those. So you can try to have embryos without those and select the ones that don't. It would be a far better world if you were able to tell those parents, look, we created half a dozen embryos for you. They all have ALS, but it's okay because now we can tweak these embryos so they don't have ALS anymore. That's the beginning of the engineering part of where we're at. And we're not quite doing it yet. But as I said, it could go back even a step. It could be that, well, if my testes are the problem because my testes are passing on this ALS, then I just need to tweak my testes, and then all the children that I have will be fixed. But that no one's even doing that yet or trying.
But that would be the unusual case of somatic engineering that resulted in inherited traits.
Right. Yeah. And the reason it's inherited is because if you do something at the blastocyst stage at 8 cells or 16 cells, then you have a very good chance of those traits being inherited, but being in the complete body of the person who's born from it, but also then inherited.
Yeah. So that's the poster case for germline genetic engineering, an inherited disease that runs in the family, like potentially ALS or the breast cancer gene, and you either can or very soon will be able to edit it out of the germline, so that is one worry that is taken off the table. And
can I just set aside one thing that often comes up in this context, which is, what if we edit out something that we really want? Like, sickle cell anemia protects you against malaria. It's like, well, guess what? If we can edit it out, we can edit it back in. It's like, that really doesn't seem that insuperable an obstacle. And plus, do you think that the only solution to malaria-bearing mosquitoes in the future will be giving people sickle cell anemia?
That's your second point, I think, is stronger than your first point. Namely, it's quite likely, this is a little bit like in the life extension debate, if we can come up with the remarkable technology to do X, we'll probably be able to come up with the more basic technology to do Y. About editing back in, there, I think it's probably more tricky and more complicated from a technical point to edit back in than to edit back out, because you're editing out in the germline stage. Usually you'd have to edit back in the somatic stage. So, right?
Right. Well, and this raises the important point that a lot of these conditions that we're talking about are multigenic and actually spectrums and not on and off. And the argument that I would generally make is that we should be oriented towards the risks and the benefits and the costs of these therapies as opposed to whether they're therapy versus enhancement. So, for instance, there's a bunch of genes that determine cognitive function. You have, if you're trying to tweak it, it's going to be, at least a dozen genes that you would have to tweak in order to do something, which we can do now. You can load up a CRISPR shot with a bunch of different targets. But you're going to be moving people along a spectrum from low cognitive, in this case, if it was a treatment for low cognitive ability embryo, would be to move them up the spectrum a little bit. But at what point does moving people up a spectrum cross the line from therapy to enhancement? If the case of the kids that he is his name, the Chinese physician who edited 2 babies for allegedly for HIV resistance, that those therapies also had been implicated in cognitive, moving people having higher cognitive abilities. So it was potentially also a cognitive enhancement therapy. So, but how much would it have to do in order for it to actually be a therapy, an enhancement as opposed to a therapy? But at any rate, I think this whole distinction of therapy, the thing that I take seriously about your observation that it's easier to take things out than to put them in is that I do think we have a better understanding of what baseline function of a body is, so that we have these single gene mutations that cause severe disorders, and if we just change that gene, we could return someone to a baseline. That's a different clinical testing and safety side effects regime than trying to say, I'm going to change a dozen things about intelligence and see what happens. That's an entirely different kind of experiment.
So, I guess we should tell our listeners that in some way this conversation is speculative in the sense that we are almost there with germline genetic engineering by and large, but we're not quite yet there. And I'm assuming that part of the way in which we're not there is that we haven't identified sufficiently the genetic pathways from gene to trait yet, or from gene to groups of traits. Is that fair?
Yeah, the genome-wide association studies that people do, this large correlational analysis of genes related to traits, most of them find hundreds of genes related to any trait, heart disease, cancer, whatever it is. So it's really no situation yet where there's a killer, or the opposite, a savior gene that we just change this one gene and everything improves. But
the AIDS-resistant babies was an example that was actually done, wasn't it?
That one was actually done, but it also illustrates the political obstacle that it's illegal in a lot of places.
Chinese were very excited about it until they got the pushback.
China's something that we have to definitely talk about in this context, because China has some of the fewest restrictions and some of the most enthusiasm for children of choice and for genetically tweaking the next generation in the world. And
that's really where you want to plant your flag, Dr. Hughes?
No. I'm saying that it's a concern because they don't have. As much as I have been fighting with the conservative, moral, panicky West over these issues for a long time, I would rather fight with people who care about consent and children's rights and disability rights and all that stuff than people who didn't care about that at all. Right. So, I think the China example goes in the other direction. But I think the reaction to he was actually that, they saw that this was a threat to their reputation around the world. And they punished him, and he went to prison for, 2 years or something. But he's back in the lab now, and he's quite successful and quite famous.
That's right. And I was reading about him and watching the documentary on him, and he had this kind of Excel spreadsheet up in a lecture that he gave, and there was a list of a good 15, 20 genes there that were specifically correlated to traits like, IBD, and so I guess there are some. We should probably say that the advent of AI and its introduction into this mix is probably going to shorten the process of connecting genes and traits, and that's one of the big promises of it. In addition,
Maybe that's what 23andMe will do with all that data that they're selling online.
Yeah. So let's assume for a moment. Let's put aside for a moment, if you think that is philosophically coherent, the question of correlating genes with traits, and assume X hypothesis that we will make progress with that, or relatively rapid progress with that, or at least make progress with that, with some traits.
And to be clear, I mean, I think there's substantial evidence, decades and decades of evidence, that things like fundamental personality traits are substantially genetic. About 15% of the variation in the 5-factor ocean scores for personality traits is heritable and shared between twins and so forth. So there are a lot. There's, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, an evolutionary psychologist, but I do think that there's a lot of evidence on that side.
So the same CRISPR that will be able to edit the breast cancer gene out of the family germline will also one day be able to edit a mathematical aptitude into it, or the capacity for spatial orientation or whatever, which is important for being a good engineer or something like that. So that's where I both get, and it will surprise you, agree with your skepticism about the therapy versus enhancement distinction. But the point of that distinction, so the therapy enhancement distinction, again, for our listeners, is if one day we need a tool for policy making around genetic engineering, we would be more tolerant of the interventions that were for therapeutic purposes, like removing the breast cancer gene, than we were for making our future babies good engineers by improving their spatial capacities. And so one is a therapy, getting rid of cancer, another is an enhancement, making you a better engineer than you otherwise would. You'd be patient about the first and impatient about the other. And I think you're totally right that if you can cure a bunch of conditions, then you've enhanced that person because you've changed their behavior patterns, for example, all about those conditions. But what other better guideline do you have for policymaking, if not therapy versus enhancement?
Well, I think I have argued for a long time that the quality-adjusted life year is the basic consequentialist logic to defend for all healthcare prioritization. And that basically says, for what cost can we rule out this intervention? How many people are going to use it? How much benefit will they get? And let's figure out the best way to spend dollars. So in the case of reproductive medicine, the evidence has been clear for a very long time that making a full repertoire of reproductive health services available to families, including counseling about family history of conditions, prenatal testing, regular clinic visits during a pregnancy, and the option of termination of a pregnancy, that all of those improve outcomes in various ways and are worth the investment of a government if they're interested in any metrics of social utility. And so the basic argument is that that's what governments should do. And I think most governments accept that, ensuring that the health of the next generation by providing as much of that information, those services to parents as possible is good.
But doesn't that skirt the question a little bit of, like, again, what is it that you're counting as health and what is it that you're not?
Right. And after World War II, the general drift of Western bioethics, not Chinese and others, but Western bioethics has been to be as non-interventionist as possible. Because the things about eugenics that we don't like historically, in retrospect, and that certainly at the time, was that it was coercive. It was the government telling people what kinds of traits they should and shouldn't pass on and so forth. So if the logic is reproductive freedom means the government gives you the resources and the knowledge to make decisions, and then you have the power to make decisions, I think we're all on the same page. But there are people who consider that to be leading to designer babies. And I think that, as you said, if there's no necessary distinction between selection, these moral distinctions between selection and actual engineering, I think, are irrelevant.
So when you say the government gives you the resources, you're sort of envisioning a kind of social democratic medicine of the future that covers editing out breast cancer and ALS from the germline, but that doesn't cover making your kids blonde and tall, and that should be left up to parents to pay for?
That's precisely the policy scenario that I have been thinking about for a long time, right?
Yeah.
That the current situation in social democracies is that women have the right to know the contents of their wombs within certain negotiated constraints and to make abortion decisions on the basis of that. And I think that's the right policy. I think, and then the question is, should they be able to know and make that decision on the basis of gender? Should they be able to know and make it on the basis of other things? So if you're okay with those selective decisions on the part of parents, they have a dozen embryos to choose and they decide I would prefer the blonde one or the brunette, is that a moral thing to have told them in the first place, and is that a moral choice for them to make? Should the government be facilitating that kind of decision? And there's certainly governments who don't want to facilitate decisions that they consider to be non-therapeutic, which would include cosmetic or enhancement decisions.
So then my sense is that then we didn't really get away from the therapy versus enhancement distinction.
Well, the governments are going to use therapy to determine both what can be researched. So we don't even know if some things are going to be safe if they're applied in a non-therapeutic context, but also what things are going to be covered within a health system. Now, if you're a wild west of reproductive health services like the United States, then clinics can just do what they do and offer what they offer. The only real constraints in the United States is not so much government policy, although that's changing day by day, but the constraints on the part of the providers. The cytogeneticists have their own have their own organizations and their own ethical strictures, and many cytogeneticists don't think it's ethical to, for instance, test for and provide information about gender in the course of a pregnancy, and others do.
Yeah. So we will be, I guess, scientifically, there's no sort of way around the fact that we will be sooner rather than later in a situation where the same tool is going to be used for therapeutic purposes as can be used for either frivolous or eugenic purposes. So the same CRISPR, once we have enough knowledge, can be used to cure cancer or to prevent cancer as to make blonde babies who are good engineers.
Right. And for every parent, in a pro-life context, it's like, wouldn't you rather us be in the situation where we can tell a parent that we could tweak their embryos so that they don't have this disability or disease, and then you could not have an abortion decision ahead of you? I think that's the obvious ethical choice, but it does. That's the beginning of crossing the threshold from simple selection to engineering.
Right. Now, if the question of coverage is going to be one of your policy solutions, so if you're going to say, as a social democratic healthcare system, not that we have one, but fantasizing is still legal.
The president's had promised to make IVF free to every woman in America, so we'll see.
There you go. There's a nice expression in Hebrew that says write it on ice. But if you go to a kind of distinction that says the government will cover the less controversial applications, the therapeutic applications like removing the breast cancer gene or the ALS gene, and the rest, since we don't want to be coercive, and since we have such justifiably bad memories about eugenic coercion or frivolous coercion for that matter, the rest is going to be up to parents. Then, and the tool is available. Then you do enter the kind of socio-economic morass that the rich parents will be able to get tall engineer babies, and the poor parents will only be able to get babies that don't get cancer.
Right. So there's safety, efficacy, and whether it should be covered ethically by a government. Right. So there'll be lots of tests, and this is already true of the genome tests that that people do on themselves, that you do with 23andMe, and the ones that you get at an IVF clinic, those tests are not definitive, right? Even sperm sorting, like sperm sorting is a children of choice technology, which basically says, I think it's it's the female sperm, the sperm carrying XX chromosomes. I don't know enough biology even to do this, but apparently you can sort sperm into which ones are going to make boys and girls, and that's only about 90% accurate. But at any rate, a lot of these tests are going to be of low quality in terms of their predictive ability. Then there's the unknown side effects issue and the ability to do safety testing. So without those two pieces, I don't think it's very easy to roll something out to an entire population. But I think we have to imagine situations where a gene is identified that 90% of us have, and if you turn off that one gene or tweak it somehow, everybody lives 50% longer. And then the question is, in the same way that vaccinating your kids may be a moral obligation because it saves them from preventable disease, wouldn't we have an obligation to strongly encourage, in whatever means we have available, that parents should do this with their kids? We're not in that situation yet, but I do think we have to think about that, because every decision that's made in reproductive ethics is a negotiation between parental rights and state rights, right? The state has an obligation to ensure that the next generation's rights are protected in some way, and the parental rights are protected. But should parents be able to make their kids dumber? Should they be able to make their kids less able? If they're doing that systematically after they're born, we take them away. But if they make decisions about that before they're born, what do we do?
Why not ban parental choice of non-therapeutic interventions?
Because I don't think the government, I think this is a negotiation about what a liberal government should be doing. How much and in what ways should they tell parents what they can do with their own reproduction? If I go to a Medicaid clinic for IVF, they don't exist, but if I go to a clinic and I get a government-funded test for diseases and disabilities, but if I want to know eye color and gender, I have to go down the street to a cyto clinic, and that's the situation in the state, in this U.S. right now, then I have to pay out of pocket for that, and it's only going to be accessible to affluent people. So then the question is, if you're thinking about this in a consequentialist way, are we sure that making that available through the public dime wouldn't be better? And are the consequences of a class-divided society making these kinds of genetic choices, how serious are those consequences going to be? I don't think any of the things that we're talking about now are of the substantial nature of, social division. Like the classic example is the Time Machine from H.G. Wells. It's like he imagined that the inbreeding among the effete aristocracy and among the working class would lead to these two entirely different species. We don't want that outcome. I don't think that that's a very likely outcome. But if you could show me that there was something that cost $1 billion that you could do to your kids that would make them Lex Luthor style supervillains, then yes, I don't want only the billionaires' kids to have that. I think then we can talk about what kinds of interference in reproductive decision making are legitimate. But I think at the minimal level, the government is saying we're going to cover certain things, we're not going to cover others, and that one of the criteria that they have about that is risk and safety and efficacy, and all of those are correlated with how novel the thing is that we're trying to do, which is inescapable. Then I think that that's a legitimate, transition for us to be in.
Well, I mean, look, we could as a society become pretty convinced that for future success, mathematical aptitude and interviewing skills are two very important traits and skills to have. Well, we kind of have become convinced about some of that. And so more wealthy parents spend in the neighborhood of about $15,000 and more for preparing their kids to college, and everything from sort of college preparatory specialized courses, SAT training, counseling, and choosing your college list, et cetera, et cetera. So we already do that at the lower part of the age scale for younger people. And then older people get very expensive and increasingly effective anti-aging treatments, like, hyperbaric oxygen and, all kinds of stuff. And my sense is that you're looking at a society that encodes some of these decisions into the genes. So yes, we're already doing it, right? So the rich parents are putting a lot of money into preparing their kids better for college, and then their kids have better college results quite often. But you're looking at a kind of situation where then, if the society is liberal enough, richer parents are going to engineer their kids for mathematical aptitudes and interviewing skills, again on the assumption that you can identify the genetic paths.
This runaway feedback loop idea is popular out there. I hear it always about these issues. But I say, well, why wasn't there a runaway feedback loop with literacy? If you say that literacy allows you to make more money, become more successful, more powerful, and then you're going to hire tutors, and then your kids are going to be literate, and nobody else is going to be.
Parents are lazy, and literacy requires work.
Well, yes, it requires work, but
this requires less work.
It was also perceived to be a general good, right? And as if the government made it available to everyone, most parents would avail themselves of it, except for a very small and problematic minority. Mm-hmm. And most people will become literate. And I think that in this context, we're saying, okay, if we have some gene therapy that we think is generally useful, and we make it widely available to people through public resources, then hopefully, if it's proven to be useful, everyone will adopt it, and we won't have these kinds of class distinctions.
Yeah, but we won't make all of it available to public resources.
So the things that we leave to the market, how dangerous for society in various ways will those market choices be? And I think for some of them, I don't care. I mean, if the children of wealthy people become skinnier, which already doesn't need a genetic choice, but if you have access to Ozempic, you can be skinny. But if that's the consequence, that unfortunate. But if they become dangerously different from us, which I think in some ways the rich already are dangerously different. So I mean, I think
but it's overcomable,
we do have to take it,
right? Yeah. So a smart, plucky, not wealthy kid can go to the library or talk to ChatGPT and make up some of the difference, because the difference isn't encoded into their brain. Under other circumstances,
but genes will be equally malleable in this future, right? So if there's a gene that the rich have, the gene therapy in the end shouldn't be that expensive, right? Mm-hmm. It should be as cheap as getting a vaccination. And so it's like that movie Elysium, where all the rich people live in orbital habitats and have all the best medicine, but they don't share it with the rest of the planet. Well, why aren't you sharing it with the rest of the planet?
You're saying eventually it will become available to everybody. It depends on how long the interval is. Will the rich have enough time to get like some good escape velocity in the meantime while it becomes available to everyone?
Their kids would have to be awfully smart to, in 20 years, turn the world on its head with their smarts. So, yeah, I'm not so concerned about that. I do think that the social democratic solution is already the solution, because there's already selection effects. The other thing to say about this is that most people, IVF is still an uncertain and expensive procedure. And even making it free and universally accessible doesn't really change the population needle that much. Denmark has very liberal policies about access to IVF because they want to have more babies, but it hasn't really changed their birth rate. So I think there's a lot of moral panic about IVF in general, but also designer babies or genetic selection. Yeah. When you look at the actual technologies, it's going to be very, very few people making these choices.
Yeah. Let me ask you a slightly more abstract question, and I do hope that you appreciate my self-restraint and the truth. We've been talking for half an hour, and I haven't brought up Gattaca yet because I want to spare your nerves.
Pushes my button.
Exactly. I have a question for you about the relationship of this and our sort of classical understanding of evolution. So the sort of paradigm version of evolution is that random variations are naturally selected for their advantages they confer in a given environment, and that's how we end up with opposable thumbs, et cetera, et cetera. If and when this kind of really takes off, that is put on its head, I'm assuming, right? So, because it would be, instead of random variations, it will be chosen variations, artificially selected. So so we basically replace natural selection on this on this new understanding of biology. So number one, is my understanding correct? And number two, are we competent to replace natural selection?
We replaced natural selection a long time ago in various ways, it's like,
but in a half-assed way, yeah, for labradoodles, that's not such a big deal.
Well, we also replaced it for ourselves because our class structures, our caste systems, our genocides all had reproductive consequences. But yes, okay, it wasn't planned and it wasn't intentional. But we have also been changing genetically. Just urbanization created an immense amount of change in human genes over the last 10,000 years. So,
yeah, but you could argue that given how gradual, at least some of the time, these processes have been, it's not as much as a deviation from random variation and natural selection as this is going to be. You're literally going to say, you know what? I looked at the past 2 generations. I project into the future. I think that it's really important that my grandkids will be very good at engineering to be successful, and I will try to engineer them to have engineering brains. Again.
Well, let me pause on this point, the open future point, a little bit, because then I'll come back to the or should we control evolution point. The open future point is important because people like Habermas have rejected reproductive choice, designer babies, however you want to call it, on the grounds that we're closing off the options of our future children by making choices on their behalf. Mm-hmm. And I thoroughly reject his argument and that argument in general, because I think when we think about the kinds of choices, most of the choices that people want to make about their reproduction, they're actually choices that would expand the life options of their children. But I do think that this, are these choices that you're making for your kid going to be help them in an open and uncertain future, or are they going to narrow their options? I think that's a legitimate thing for us to think about individually when we make these choices, but also at a policy level.
Let me say a word about that. I mean, look. So one thing you're saying is like, does my endowing a child with a bunch of enhancements say the chance that they're a better engineer or a better piano player based on my own thoughts for their future narrow their choice? On the one hand, no, because there's a bunch of people who are talented at engineering that decide to become painters anyway. Mm-hmm. That's certainly true. But in fairness, 2 things do constrain the choice here to some extent, which is there is a general human tendency to go in the direction of what you are talented in because it's easier. And so if you are programmed, as it were, to be more talented, you'll at least get a bit of a nudge in one direction. And there's a nudge, somewhat of a nudge, involved in growing up and knowing that your parents have designed you for functionality X, Y, and Z that goes into one's psychological makeup of what's expected from them. People don't necessarily do it. They don't even often do it, but it does change their calculation. Now, does this happen anyway? Yeah, it does happen anyway, but it doesn't happen at the cellular level.
There's a phenomenon called savior babies, which is that if you have a child that needs a bone marrow transplant, and none of your relatives fit the bill, you can conceive another child that has the compatible bone marrow and have them provide bone marrow transplant, which is a painful procedure for the first child. And I think that this is no surprise. I think this is probably defensible. But the observation of the families that have done this, do they love the child that they conceive for a specific purpose any less? No.
Yeah.
They love them.
But that's
even
not what we're
more.
talking about. I'm sure.
Okay,
yeah.
But what I'm talking about is
a constraint of choice by these technologies.
If you make a choice to say, okay, I want to make sure my kids have the most cognitive ability possible, but I don't care about what they do with it. That's one kind of choice. But a lot of parents do go into parenting saying, I really think my kids need musical ability. I'm going to put them in Suzuki classes from the age of 2. The first toy they're going to have is a violin. Yeah. You're making a choice for your kid. You're making a choice if you only.
But you didn't give them you didn't literally build them a musician brain. You slightly changed their synapse structures. Probably.
But parents can have very strong preferences for what their kids can want to do, and that can be compatible with loving them. And it turns out that the evidence is that the kids of choice, kids born through assisted reproduction, are generally as or more happy than kids who are born through the accidental method. Now, the accidental method is what everyone else is doing, right? So I think that's the legitimate comparison. It's like,
but this is a third level, because we have accidental kids, we have kids of choice, and then you're going to have kids of choice, choicefully designed. And the question that we're trying to think about is, are these kids of choice intentionally designed? Is their future or freedom in any way constrained? And I agree with you that it's not fully constrained, but I just do want to suggest that the very fact that you are talented at X, Y, and Z by design is going to give you a nudge in one direction or another. And the very fact of knowing that your parents wanted something enough for you to literally encode it into your genes is going to give you a nudge in some direction.
How much of stand-up comedy is about disappointing your parents' expectations? I mean, every person faces this choice, right? And my parents had this expectation, I went this other way.
But don't you think, this kind of veers into psychoanalysis, but literally encoding your expectations into your kid's germline is a little bit different than telling them, why can't you become a doctor?
Okay, so no one knows how to encode that your kid has to feel or wants to feel to be a certain thing, right? That we don't know how to do that. Hopefully we never figure it out.
We never will.
Yeah. But the ability to do that, your kids are already born with different abilities. And one of your responsibilities as a parent is, son, I think you're 4 foot tall. You're probably not going to be a basketball player, but you might excel at these other things, right? That's part of your obligation as a parent, is to steer them in the direction. Now, if you gave them a Suzuki violin lessons from 2 and they turned out to be a great Suzuki violin lesson, you made just choices for them without any of their consent. And it turned out okay.
Yeah.
The tragedy is when parents can't let go of their expectations and love their kid anyway. And that's a tragedy that we all face already. It doesn't have anything to do with what choices you made genetically.
Yeah, but you've sunk a lot more cost into it. I mean, look, if you've genetically engineered them to do it, I mean, there's different levels. You could say, son, I'd like you to be an engineer like your father is. And then you could say, son, I'd like you to be an engineer like your father is. And I'd like that so much that I made sure that your spatial perception is far superior to average. And you should know that your parents put a lot of money into doing that. So that kid, that kid is going to have a different understanding of their future and a different set of calculations if they decide not to be an engineer than the one who's just told that they should be.
Well, since you brought up the influence of bad science fiction on our debates, let's talk about Gattaca.
Now you're using Gattaca to avoid my questions.
Well,
that's
I'm coming at it obliquely, which is that in the Gattaca future, for some reason, it's possible to either select. I think it's possible to engineer all these traits into an embryo. I think that's what the scenario is being presented at the beginning of Gattaca. Is they say these are what they got so far, and here's the things we can tweak. And the parents in that scenario say, we're hippies, don't tweak anything. And their kid ends up with a heart condition that will kill him by the time he's 30, and he has the aspiration to become an astronaut, okay?
Right.
Wasn't what they didn't have that aspiration for him. He has the aspiration, and it makes him miserable that he can't become an astronaut. So he decides to defraud NASA with an elaborate ruse so that he can die in space. The huge problem, the first big problem with that scenario is why haven't they figured out
It's a podcast. You can say why the fuck. It's fine.
Okay, yeah. Why the fuck did they not figure out how to fix any of these problems after people are born? Is it they just decided we'll just eliminate it all at birth and then we don't have to fix
fairness, that is harder, right? That's why
it is harder. But for him to get a gene engineered heart, or to have something that could have allowed him to participate as an astronaut the scientific implausibility of a future where you have this one black mirror technology, but you don't have all the ones that would fix it. I think that's the absurdity of that scenario. So say your kid decides, well, what my parents had available, let's not even say that it was overly restrictive. What they had available to them at the time was they could boost my musical ability. And it turns out that had an unintended side effect of making me not as physically fit, and I actually would like to be an Olympic athlete. Do you think we're not going to be in a future where you can fix whatever it is that's keeping you from being an Olympic athlete? Then we have to figure out whether you can participate in the Olympics. But in
a way, I think that's a question for a biologist. My own limited understanding is that the germline intervention is going to be more fundamental and more powerful than a future somatic one. But
on the safety, the FDA safety issue, we're in an accelerationist moment, so far as I can tell, with the FDA. And one of the questions that we've had is, how do we determine the consequences, the long-term, potentially epigenetic, but at least genetic consequences of these interventions? And the FDA has now said that they're going to start removing the requirement of animal testing from some of these, because they think that the in silico models that we have can start to substitute for doing things with animals. Now, animal testing, as we know, is already imperfect in terms of predicting long-term consequences. We've always had this problem. It's like, you could do 100 generations of E. coli in a week, but does tweaking a gene in E. coli and looking for the side effects in E. coli tell you anything about what it's going to do to humans over a long period of time?
Yeah.
For me, it comes back to this question of, don't you think we'll be in a future where these things will be fixable? Because yes, I do think it's very difficult to figure out. Like there's that drug that was used for, not thalidomide, but there was a drug that was used in pregnancy. I forget, I'm spacing on which one. But anyway, which had cancer consequences, cervical cancer consequences for the granddaughters of the women who took it, right? So there can be these generational skips in the impacts of different kinds of tweaks. And we know that, for instance...
So basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, the answer is, which is an interesting one, is that even if these genetic constraints do have an influence on the sense of the future of the kids, there will be technological answers to, enable the pushback against parents' wills, just like there's behavioral answers to allow pushback against our parents' wills right now. Something like that?
Future societies will be able to overcome whatever unintentional or intentional constraints your parents put on you by the genetic choices that they made. I don't see a future where that's not possible. I mean, the idea of a genetic caste system where your parents make a choice and you're forever a beta or an alpha or whatever, that's not the future we're going to. Everybody's going to want their kids to be an alpha, and the ones that unintentionally end up being something else, they're going to be alphas too. So
you are an optimistic dude. Because we certainly have social caste systems over generations, but you think that genetics is going to cure all of this. But hold on, I do want to go back, since I don't think we're going to resolve this one.
I don't think it's going to cure it all. We still need social revolution, but good.
There we go. Back to the guillotine. I knew that,
Yeah, the guillotine plus genetic engineering, that'll get us there.
All right, Robespierre with CRISPR is the fever dream of Dr. Hughes. I was asking you earlier when we started this, when we started the discussion about the Operan future, are we competent enough to take over natural selection?
Yeah. So actually, Walter Truett Anderson is one of my early intellectual influencers. He wrote a book called To Govern Evolution. He was talking mostly about the impact of human beings on the natural order for the last 10,000 years, which we've, wiped out mega flora and fauna all over the world. But saying we need to take responsibility for this, but he also extended it to the genome. And I think that's basically right. We're at the situation where whether through inaction, which is also a form of policy choice, or through action, we are going to be influencing characteristics of the next generation, and we have to make some intentional choices about that. I want those choices to be as much governed by individual choice in a liberal society as possible, and that's why I'm arguing for a limited liberal regime of regulating genetic choices. But yes, I do think the danger with the idea of governing evolution is that you have some kind of perfectionist idea of what kind of thing we're evolving towards or what kind of people should be evolving. And I don't have those ideas, and I don't want those ideas to be in public policy. But the idea that it's better to have less pain than more pain, the idea that it's better to have more ability than less ability, I think that those are already accepted as the principles of public health around the world, and that's the good ones to go with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the downside with the acceleration of these and other kinds of technologies is that the margin of error that a more classical understanding of evolution gives you disappears, right? So at least natural random variation and natural selection gives a long time for seeing if things work themselves out or not. This
is like arguing with people about world government, and they say, if we had world government, everything would be bland. There would be no differences between people. And it's like, we're in a world where we can't get international agreement to stop genocide, right? I'm not going to talk about any particular genocide, but I'm just saying like any genocide. And so to start worrying about this monoculture that you think might occur if people had genetic choices, it's like, you think tomorrow everyone's going to choose to make their kids look like Lady Gaga? I doubt it, I think
pretty quickly, I mean, don't know about Lady Gaga, but pretty quickly people are going to choose to change traits on the basis of what they think would generate the best future, yeah.
Okay, and our friend Rob Sparrow has actually pushed this reductio ad absurdum. He's argued that if you really care about giving your children an open future, you should only have female children because they have better life outcomes than men. It's like, if that were to be actually the choice that people made, I'm fine with that. It's actually the choice that a lot of Japanese women make. Japan's one of the few countries where sex-selective abortion favors girls instead of boys because women would rather have daughters than sons. But at any rate, I think, you could make that argument about race. It's like, if you're black and you think that white kids are going to have a easier time in the world, why wouldn't you have white kids? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious, because most people don't want to have kids that are different from them, right? We want kids that share our traits and that we see continuity with. And so that's going to be one huge constraint. The parents who don't care about that, I mean, and God bless parents who don't care about that at all. It's not that I have anything against parents who would decide to have mixed race families or adoptive families or whatever, but I don't think most people will make those choices in the short term. The technology is never going to, is for the foreseeable future going to be pretty expensive to do, the in vitro fertilization process. So it's not going to affect that many people.
So you think the impact on evolution is not going to be that dramatic for a very long time anyway?
I mean, our practices around how we live as a civilization have been, as I said, already impacting evolution, and in ways we take care of our sick and infirm, right? We don't practice the ruthless eugenics of infanticide and sending our old people out on the ice floes or whatever we used to. So we've already been impacting our genetics just by becoming more humane society. What we're going to do in the future, hopefully, is take a more conscious approach to it, and one that respects individual rights and make sure that we don't have bad consequences. But I do think we should have a conscious approach to what kinds of traits. Like, I'll give you an example with the psychological stuff. I'm worried about a future in which people have more control over their brains and in which they decide that certain traits are better for getting ahead in the world in a competitive, cutthroat society, right? That turn down your empathy, for instance,
right,
might be a fix. And I'm worried about that for adults, but I'm even more worried about parents making any choice like that for their kids. I want my kid to be the worst Gordon Gekko that he could possibly be. And I think that those kinds of choices, Nick Bostrom, he wrote a paper a long time ago about existential risks. And one of the people always focus on the big ones like artificial intelligence, eating us. But one of the smaller ones that doesn't get discussed very often is that we all just make individual choices. And those individual choices lead us to lose the things that we thought were important about being human beings. Now, as much of a transhumanist as I am, and as I often think that kind of argument smuggles in concepts that I don't like, I do think it's fundamentally right. And one of those is like if we ended up in a future in which people didn't have empathy anymore, that would be a bad future. And I don't want that to happen either through choice or through accident.
Yeah, but this would be the technology that would allow that to happen. And you could see in the Gordon Gekko world why people would make that choice, even though it would be a terrible choice.
Right. And that's that's why I say that a social democrat should never make a libertarian argument around these things, right? Yeah. I do think there are limits. There are certainly social concerns about equity, social concerns about future well-being of children and society that have to put limits on these things. I just don't think that anything that we're facing right now warrants putting a limit on reproductive decision-making.
Got it. Maybe one last theme, bring in your pal Michael Sandel here. So your second favorite take on genetic engineering. So in a essay that I like a lot and you don't like at all, called The Case Against Perfection, that was later turned into a book, Sandel makes, he talks about a few of the things that we covered here, but he makes one point that I take to be the most interesting. And he says the real problem at the end of the day with designer babies or germline genetic engineering for traits in babies is not around questions of autonomy and open future, and not even about questions of decoding the rich elite, but around this idea of giftedness, that our appreciation of human performance comes from the fact that we have not completely engineered and designed and controlled the traits that go into that performance. And Gattaca actually has a sort of dramatization of the argument that he makes, where there's that famous scene where Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman go to a piano recital, they listen to this transporting sublime piece of music, and they really enjoy it. And then at the end of the piece of music, the pianist sort of throws his glove at the audience, and it turns out that they have 6 fingers on each hand, and that they were designed to have the 6 fingers. And, the kind of question suggests itself of, does that, once you know it, after you heard the piece, does that kind of come back and change your experience of the piece? Similarly, if you're going to watch Diego Armando Maradona do his famous slalom against the English in 1986, and you're like, holy shit, this is the most amazing thing, and I can't believe it. And then you find out that Maradona was genetically engineered to be able to have that kind of coordination and that kind of speed and that kind of control of the ball, that kind of undoes your fascination with the performance, and that fascination is predicated in the first place on a kind of sense of wonder rather than on engineering.
This, in the first place, the sports analogy gets back to the selection versus engineering question. It's like, I think it might be great for sports, because I hate sports, if all sports were obligated to take random selections of the public instead of selecting the 10 guys or women who are the best in the world at whatever they're doing. Yeah. So, these are not random selections of human specimens. Mm-hmm. They go through training regimes which are completely unnatural, especially at the top.
But they still leave room for awe from talent, which here Sandel argues doesn't exist anymore in a world that's genetically engineered, and the awe would move from Michael Jordan or from Maradona to the geneticist who made them what they are.
Well, to the minor extent that I'm ever awed by an athletic performance, I'm also always aware that these people are completely different human specimens than me. And
it doesn't matter to you that they're completely different specimens by accident.
They could have 14 fingers. I don't care if they're completely different specimens from me. So that doesn't make any difference to me.
But they're accidentally different. They wouldn't necessarily have to be different in the world that we've been talking about. You could be that specimen easily if you were correctly germline engineered for it. Again, assuming the big assumption that we figured out those pathways. So there's nothing remarkable anymore about the engineering.
I do not think that the
specimen.
existing maldistribution of talents between human beings invalidates anyone with talent and their accomplishments, right? And so the fact that some bodies, that the Williams sisters had a father who pushed them in the direction of becoming tennis superstars. I do not think that invalidates their accomplishments. It explains them. It's a part of the picture about them, right?
Yeah, but that's because part of their accomplishments come from this kind of mysterious talent randomly distributed. And that part of appreciating their performance would disappear in a genetically engineered world.
Well, if there was one pianist with 6 fingers and he was the best in the world, you might have an argument. And when there's a million, there are going to be one best one among them, right? So, the fact
talent doesn't go anywhere in this picture.
I mean, one thing that we haven't brought up that's part of this kind of are we going to be monocropping our future or not is that we're as likely to become more genetically diverse in the future as we are more similar. I think there are certain things certain disabilities and diseases which will be gradually edited out, and other directions, like if there are trade-offs between cognitive faculties that parents make, if they're allowed to make them, then some parents will make one choice and others another, right? If there's a choice between synthetic artistic ability and analytical cognitive ability, then some parents will go one direction and others another. Then we will have to pay close attention to whether that was a good thing to allow them to make those decisions. But I think we're going to have diversity. We're going to have people with different skins and genders and all kinds of things as a consequence of these biomedical innovations. Now, let's talk about gender for a second. I think the evidence is that, for the most part, the gender selective practices around the world have been evening out. India and China being the biggest examples of this, but they have adopted policies which have been more successful in encouraging people to have female children and to restrict access to sex-selective abortion. In the West, it's mostly for sex balancing. But I think that the sex selection issue raises this. It's like if you choose to have, if you cared enough about having a daughter after you had 2 sons and you wanted a daughter in your family, if you cared enough about that to go to IVF, I think there's a very strong argument that kind of choice is one that we should be allowing because it will increase familial happiness and bondedness. I'm sure you're aware of the abortion crime link argument that once we allowed abortions in the 1970s, the number of unwanted pregnancies went down dramatically, and that unwanted pregnancies is one of the predictors of having a life with the criminal justice system, and that this may have been one of the things.
So contrary to Sandel's argument, you're saying that actually, because Sandel argues that part of the condition for sort of attachment and concern, as it were, of parents to their kids is this notion of the unbidden, right? This notion of the unchosen, rather than seeing kids as artifacts of our own design. And your point is actually, in many cases, it's quite the opposite, that if we care enough to design and to bid, those children are going to be much greater objects of concern and love. And in fact, the surprise won't go away. The element of surprise or element of wonder won't go away because there'll be plenty of other factors.
Right.
From which
this
it
began
will grow.
with family planning, 10,000 years ago when we first started fooling around with contraception. Mm-hmm. But in the last century, hasn't the logic been that every family should make the decision about when and how many children to have consciously? Isn't that, or was it that we should all be unbidden? Just whoops, there, it happened again. And I wasn't thinking about it, but it happened again. No, we should all be making conscious choices about this for their interests and for our own.
Yeah, and that logic has had benefits. It has had some serious costs too. That, parents have waited for too long to have children, and I mean,
well, IVF policy might have something to do with that in the future. One of the IVF policies that I think is unfortunate in places like Italy, they restricted not only to abortion to lesbians from lesbians or single women, but also from women over a certain age. I think we're going to have the ability to stimulate pregnancies in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this does go back to one of the sort of fundamental disagreements between us, and that's the sort of disagreement between, in the end, ultimately, your liberal sensibility where choice is the source of meaning, and my less liberal sensibility where actually the lack of choice can be an equally powerful source of meaning. It's kind of cool to see it sort of play out in variations across some of these different
that's right
topics.
I'm a chain breaker and you're a chain lover.
Exactly. I want to chain everybody. You want to free everybody. Oh man. Shall we move on to our
de-extinction
short discussion of contemporary affairs?
Yes. Okay, well, this week, the dire wolf was in the news. The wolf that went, I haven't followed it that closely, but the wolf that apparently has gone extinct, and some DNA was found and was introduced into some modern dogs and gave them some characteristics. And a couple weeks before that, there was the woolly mammoth mouse that had the woolly mammoth genes inserted and turned out to have a big, thick, woolly coat like a woolly mammoth. And it goes back to, of course, Jurassic Park. Again, bad science fiction informing bad bioethics.
Yeah. So the idea of bringing back species that have been extinguished, some of them just because they have, and some of them because we've helped them along, which I assume is the case of the woolly mammoth, at least.
Right.
So one thing that I thought, a couple of things that I found I have to confess, I don't know what I think about this stuff yet. I mean, I sometimes like to draw the target around where I shot my arrow, which is usually I shoot the arrow usually to the same place. Two things I'll notice before I decide where to shoot my arrow on this one. One is it's a commercial company that's done this. So a company that kind of has decided that it wants to make money out of de-extinction and has weirdly chosen two targets that are very much, or two species that are very much sort of excite the public imagination, the woolly mammoth and the
charismatic megafauna, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. And that so a commercial company doing it based on bad science fiction. What could go wrong?
Well, Jurassic Park, obviously, if you bring back something and it becomes invasive and it displaces local species, the Jurassic Park example is a particularly dramatic one of that, but it could be as true of an ancient strain of corn or an ancient bacterium. So I do think that there's some biosafety issues around bringing back extinct species. I think it's just basically another form of genetic research. I don't know that there's anything novelly dangerous about 20,000-year-old DNA versus DNA that you just discovered in, the Amazon.
Yeah, it goes back to our conversation about replacing evolution. It's another interesting example of, displacing the evolutionary process by which many of these species went extinct, or do you think that that's not a fair argument because we so much accelerated their extinction that it's kind of disingenuous to bring up evolution?
I think it's both silly to argue that this is a techno fix which will make us less likely to engage in species preservation, or the argument that we have an ethical obligation to do it on the basis of species restoration, right? The duck-billed platypus or whatever else we drove into extinction that we have an obligation to bring. I don't think there's an obligation to bring. In the first place, a species is ontologically as slippery a concept to me as a lot of other concepts. I don't know what it means to bring back a species. This direwolf example and the woolly mouse both illustrate the difficulty here. And as would Jurassic Park, if it was more honest, it's like all those dinosaurs should look a lot more like chickens, since I think that's what they were, crossbred with. Their DNA was, all the gaps was filled in with chicken DNA. But, are we really bringing back an ancient species? I don't think so. In most of these kinds of experiments. Do we have an obligation to? No. And does it necessarily make us less likely to preserve the ones we've got? No. So all of those are dumb arguments.
How about the following smart argument, if you'll allow me? De-extinction is a momentous decision, at least under some circumstances. If we decided to bring back Neanderthals, that would be a very big deal. Momentous decisions like that should not be left up.
There are already volunteers for that experiment, by the way. But go ahead.
Yeah. Momentous decisions should not be left up to private enterprise because its calculation of cost, benefit, and interest is problematic. This, like the moonshot, should be primarily a public project, subject to both the debate and the degree of consensus that, at least in healthier societies, public projects can generate. And so the problem with
why should this be a public project?
Because it's a huge deal, just like nukes should be a public project.
Okay, well, let's talk about a specific one. So let's say we wanted to raise mammoths for their potential agricultural benefit. Why should a farm have to go through any? Are you worried about mammoths roaming the countryside, interbreeding with local elephants? I mean, what's the concern?
Well, my concern really is the slippery slope concern, which would be that if we bring back mammoths, we would be on path to bringing back dinosaurs and Neanderthals, and there I think the questions are much more obvious. So, I think Jurassic Park was both bad science fiction and good science fiction at the same time. The level of hubris that you can imagine in bringing back some of these projects seems to me to be such that you should not leave it to private enterprise. You should leave it to public enterprise. Public enterprise is often incapable of doing anything, and then it won't happen.
Right.
That's my secret hope.
I mean, I'm a social democrat with democratic socialist tendencies. So, if you want to say only Venezuelan cooperatives should be allowed to do this, I'm like,
that's
okay.
right. That's what I want, because Venezuelan cooperatives can't do shit. So my argument for social democracy is political paralysis, which is much better than fascism.
Until 2 weeks ago, I just said, let the EPA work it out. It's like, well, now we don't have an EPA. But I think that there are legitimate concerns, as I said, with the risks of genetic contamination and invasive species. But those are concerns that we have with every agricultural biomedical innovation that we do. We want to make sure that it doesn't jump out of the lab. I don't think there's any substantive difference between wanting to raise woolly mammoths and wanting to raise, cows that are twice the size of normal cows or whatever you're doing. So that's not, that serious to me. But if you're saying that ultimately, if we bring, Neanderthals is an interesting example. As I said, there actually are people thinking about what it would take, and women who have volunteered to raise such a child. Mm-hmm. And I think Neanderthals would be a clear example of something that has moral standing, should have moral standing as a citizen in our society. My presumption would be that any Neanderthal would meet those criteria. And so should society step in and say, no, you can do it with mammoths, you can do it with these others, but you can't do it with our closest human or maybe even primate species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you shouldn't do it at all. But as we said, I still need to draw the target around that arrow, if I'm being very honest. So that's why we're gonna make a separate episode out of this, in which I shall paint that target, and you shall say how stupid it is.
The sequencing of the genome of humans and great apes has also allowed us to hone in on a number of key genetic changes that appear to have allowed our cognitive complexity to advance. And then these genes are being experimented on in transgenic mouse models, where they're seeing if you can get the mice to behave differently when they're introduced. This, I think, has some clear potentials, that, for instance, great apes appear to be much more resistant to cancer than we are. If we could figure out when the genetic change occurred that allowed great apes to be to have cancer resistance that we lost, we might be able to re-engineer that into ourselves. Is that us resurrecting Homo habilis? No, that's just using the genetic research and the DNA that we've been able to find in archaeology to do interesting things today. And I think that that's one of the potential upshots I see of all this.
Yeah. I guess one thought here is that this involves the extinction project involves some interesting tendencies in moral psychology. So at different points in our debates over time, we've had, discussions about the yuck factor and this whole wisdom of repugnance kind of argument, namely that the fact that something is disgusting to you isn't an argument to either do it or not to do it, because not to do it primarily because people are not smart enough to be disgusted by, the wrong thing, and often are disgusted because of their prejudices. This, in an interesting way, seems to me the flip side of that conversation. A lot of this is happening because of a wow factor rather than because of a yuck factor, or because of something that you might call the wisdom of fascination. So just because something is awesome or fascinating or cool to me, like bringing back the dire wolf or the woolly mammoth, I'm going to do it. That seems to be the sort of bro sensibility of the companies that are working on this. And that seems to be equally idiotic, I have to say.
I'm with you on that. I mean, I think there are parallel arguments in things like space. It's like everyone's fascinated by humans in space. Turns out sending bags of meat and water into space to be space explorers is a bad idea. If we sent robots, we could do a lot more with asteroids and Mars and the moon than we currently do. But that's not sexy to people. So yeah, I mean, the charismatic megafauna is a term that people came up with in the environmental movement because it's a lot easier to get people worried about the extinction of something that's cute and furry than some darterfish or bug. So yeah, I do worry about this industry. I mean, I think some of the people who pioneered the discussion, people like George Church at Harvard, he was the one who started talking about the mammoth and Neanderthal. I think that they have more benign motivations, but there's a lot of hucksterism and hype in the field. Sure.
Yeah. Well, on this moment of rare agreement on the wow factor, we should go out on a high note.
Exactly. Well, I think we danced through that minefield relatively easily. Thank you for that conversation.
I think so too. All right. See you soon.